Welcome back, AP. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your Flip Classroom and our new discussion about the Industrial Revolution, right? So we're beginning our discussion about the Industrial Revolution. I've had a ridiculous amount of technical problems trying to record this flip and stuff like that. So I'm actually going to go ahead and introduce this flip, talk about a couple of things, and then I'm going to clip in an old one that I made last year, which is really, really solid. That I actually, ironically enough, made while I had COVID, which is really, really interesting, but it's still a really, really good flip, all right? My hair looks dumb and stuff like that, and I look like I'm freezing in it, but it's going to be fine. Now, the big thing about it, though, in general, when we're looking at this, we're talking a lot of stuff about, like, what is going to happen in the textile industry in the Industrial Revolution, right? We're talking about cheaper fabrics, we're talking about things like cotton is going to start being used. We're going to start turning away from wool because cotton is going to be easier to produce. Another big thing about that is because a lot of that cotton was actually produced in India. But another thing about it is more demand for fabric, higher pay for workers, wages will increase is going to be one of the earliest consequences of the Industrial Revolution. Until things like the power loom come along and steam power and things like that, which is going to help lead to this thing called wage stagnation, where wages will actually kind of cap off and they'll kind of like sit instead of rising commiserately with the prices like they were early on, right? So it's important to understand that the Industrial Revolution affects the upper and middle classes very, very aggressively and very, very much for the positive. Whereas for the poor, they're going to not see the biggest benefits of the Industrial Revolution up front. There's going to have to be a lot of reform and a lot of intense changes that go on throughout England and also then later on throughout the continent as the Industrial Revolution begins to spread. So looking at it as well, though, you're going to begin to see the growth of factories, right? Now, you're going to see the growth of factories, though, early factories, right? Because it's going to help lead to the fall of the cottage industry because people are realizing that if I have a building with a bunch of power looms or spinning jennies or like spinning mules inside of it, I now have a factory, right? This is going to help lead to the fall of the putting out system because the putting out system is becoming more expensive and less efficient. And it's also going to start leading to the growth of child labor and some terrible working conditions. Now, the thing about it, though, is that factory system is going to become solidified and cemented a little bit later on. We're in the 1790s right now. We're in the 1700s. We're in the first phase of the Industrial Revolution, where most of these factories are actually still located out in the countryside. So it's very, very important to understand that that's going to take a little bit of time, but we have the elements of a factory system ready to go. Now what we need to get into, though, is energy. We talked a lot about that stuff when we were talking about, when we talked about the why Britain causes, right? When we talked about why Britain, iron and coal happen to be two of the biggest reasons why it all went down in Britain. But now when we're talking about energy, though, we have to also talk about the production of iron. We also have to talk about how energy sources are going to dramatically change. Now, beginning in the early part of the Industrial Revolution, you were water power with things like the water frame, and you were also wood powered, right? Mainly to produce iron, right? Now, water was used to help run the machines, but if you wanted to produce iron or smelt iron, I know all of y'all love Minecraft, don't freak out. Some of y'all are probably going to play it right after you watch this. Now, the thing about it, though, in general, is while you smelt iron, which is when you take actual rock, like terrestrial earthen rock, that has iron inside of it, you put that into a very, very hot oven, and then you heat it up using wood to actually get the iron to melt out of the rock itself, right? And that is a process known as smelting, right? Now, the thing about it, though, when you're looking at it, is once you do that, usually what was made is this stuff. These are called iron ingots, all right? They're basically like little pieces of iron, so you can melt them and then make bigger, larger things and molds out of them, or also known as pig iron, right? Because apparently the workers in the iron smelting factories thought they looked like little piglets, right? Like little piglets that were actually about to go like get milk from their mom and stuff like that when they were actually cooling on these sand tables. Now, the thing about it, though, is the smelting process requires a ton of energy, and you're not going to be like the Dutch and use wind. You're going to be more like the English, and you're going to turn to coal, right? So we're going to start talking about that in this flip, where I'll clip it in. I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one. It's possible so you can melt the iron out of rock, right? So that is what smelting actually is you're heating up a piece of sediment and allowing the iron to bleed out of it, and then you collect the iron at the bottom, and you chop it up into these little piggies, and then you got piglets or iron ingots, right? So pig iron. So when you have that now, you can now melt that into other items, and you can cast it into molds, and you can make it into things, right? Now, going forward, though, wood power is starting to run really, really low. As McKenna Euro perfectly said, America said nope, and then literally just decided to leave, and so they were running out of their major lumber sources over in the Americas. So what are they going to turn to? They're going to turn to coal power. Now, they could have been like the Dutch and turned to wind power and saved everybody a lot of pollution, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on, right? Now, coal power, though, is going to be a massive thing that takes over all of, like, Europe. Like, literally, I was talking to you about those pepper moths. You were like, coal power literally has far-reaching consequences. So, like, look at these guys. Look at these pepper moths real quick. So, pepper moths have literally evolved over time to have these really weird color distributions. This is what they're supposed to look like naturally. This is what a lot of them look like now, because during the Industrial Revolution, the coal soot pollution got so bad that coal was caking the trees, so the darker pepper moths survived, and literally we were messing with Darwin's whole idea. It's pretty messed up when you think about it, right? So now going into it, though, we understand that coal is starting to boom, right? We get that coal is starting to take over, that there's an energy, like, kind of there. Whoa, 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 whoa. We understand that coal power is really starting to take over and really starting to push everything forward, right? Now, wait a minute, though. Pump the brakes. Where do you get this coal from? Where is it coming from? Well, another big reason why the revolution started in Britain, or the Industrial Revolution started in Britain, is because of their access to large coal deposits. Those coal deposits were stored underground, right? So the thing about it, though, is they were having a huge problem with these mining operations, right? Some of the earliest coal mines had a huge problem with flooding, right? So, and some of these earliest coal mines also had, like, weren't even just coal mines. There were mines for lead and, like, other items like that as well for the Industrial Revolution. But these mines would fill with water regularly, right? And earliest on, whenever the coal power needed to be, like, actually, like, boosted up as possible and get as much coal out of there as possible, the earliest versions of the, of getting that water out of those coal mines was using animal power, right? You would actually literally take a horse and you would tie him to a stick, and that stick would be around another stick, and the horse would walk around in a circle, pulling pulling a lever that would put a rope down into the mine with buckets, and it would bail the water out progressively, right? And that is going to be a very, very important thing coming forward. But Savary and Newcomen are two guys that come along that try to figure out a way to replace that horse, right? And they come up with the very first steam engine, right? So their steam engine, though, is very simple. Very rudimentary, very, very basic. All it requires is like a hot, like, burner, and it, like, actually creates the steam, pushing this valve up, depressing this valve, and then it has a release, and then, like, the suction then pulls it back forward. Very, very simple, not a lot to it, right? Very, very easy steam engine. You could basically make this thing at your house. But their names are Thomas Savary and John Newcomen, right? So they create this thing to try and make it so it's easier to get that water out of those mines, right? And it works pretty well for a while until this guy comes along. James Watt, who is a Scottish thinker who realizes that, wait a minute, these things break all the time. So Savary and Newcomen's biggest problem with their steam engines is they would regularly break, right? Like, they break all the time, mainly due to the fact that their steam engines vented the steam off constantly, right? And since it's venting that steam off all the time, that means that you have to keep constantly filling it with water. So if you don't have water on hand to actually fill it with, and the water needs to be decently clean, or else the impurities are going to clog the mechanism, so you have to actually keep filling it with decently clean water, and if you end up running out of it, it's going to literally, like, dry rot, and then it's not going to work, and then because you got nothing to make steam out of, right? So James Watt, the Scottish thinker and tinkerer, was called in to fix one of these steam engines, right? And he realized something. Wait a minute, what if we added a condenser onto it, right? So over here on the side, he added this specific part, a condenser. And the condenser takes some of that excess steam, condenses it onto the sides of the glass, and then the water beads off onto the bottom, and it recycles the steam in and of itself, creating a much more efficient steam engine. And then also James Watt realized, I can make these much smaller, right? And he made them much smaller, and now, wait a minute, this is the biggest thing about James Watt's steam engine. Go ahead and write this down. It can be attached to other things. It's not stationary like Thomas Savary and John Newcomen's is. This thing right here was huge and could not be moved, whereas James Watt's was small and you could slap it onto things, right? That's where the power loom came from, right? When we looked at flying shuttle, spinning Jenny, water frame, Samuel Morse's spinning mule, right? Then you take Watt's steam engine, you slap that onto one of these looms, Now that loom is fully automated. It's now steam powered, right? So like that's a big thing. You take this thing and you slap it onto a locomotive. It's a now steam powered locomotive, right? You take this thing, you put it onto a boat, steam powered boat, like the Natchez, right? For example, is a steam powered vessel. That's why it's got all those big coal smokestacks on the top of it. James Watt's thing is so important. We even see something he used to describe the power output in it in modern day society. You ever heard the phrase horsepower? It's because it's talking about the original use of those mining baling systems of those horses moving around that pivot. That's where that horsepower comes from. And James Watt was like, oh, well, my steam engine can produce X amount of horsepower, right? And also he was so famous that we use his steam engine, but we now use coal-burning power plants, and we use his steam engine to create power and electricity in the modern era. That's why we refer to what comes out of our sockets as watts, right? So look at that. Look at that. Look at it all coming full circle, right? Now we got to talk about some people's favorite things, railroads. Because apparently y'all are obsessed with this thing. Yeah, this is a song that for some reason every single year kids sing in my class whenever we talk about railroads. I don't know why, but apparently y'all are really into it, right? But the big thing about it is let's talk about railroads in general. Now, railroads are kind of like this weird little thing that like we flirt with talking about how it's slightly a part of that second industrial revolution or the tail end of the first one, but railroads are super important, and my wife is telling me I need to stop yelling. But like they have to hear me though, sweetheart.
They have volume controls on their computer.
But what if they don't know that I'm excited?
They don't need to know.
But I'm excited about railroads.
Oh my god.
So, all right, anyway, now, so check this out. The biggest thing about it, though, is the roads were already there, all right? So roads came before railroads, so you do need to understand the fact that the infrastructure that has actually been making itself available since the 1800s is available, right? Because remember we talked about absolutism and 17th and 18th century monarchs needed to increase their infrastructure and stuff like that to make like ruling over a larger domain possible? Well, building those roads is a part of that infrastructure. So the road availability was amazing, and they also, like, all you had to do now was just slap some rails on top of it. And the railroads were already there before the locomotive. So whenever you look at all these ideas about what came first, the chicken or the egg, or what came first, the railroad or the locomotive, the railroad came first, right? Because rails were just added to pre-existing roads, and they were used to move heavy carts back and forth, because when coal would come out of the mine, you would slap it into one of those carts, and the rails made it so you could push heavy carts of like coal great distances, right? And the earliest forms of railroads, they had horses pulling carts, right? Horses pulling carts down these railroads before the locomotive ever even existed. Now, the original locomotive was actually an idea to not even exist on like rails. This is the very first steam-powered locomotive. It was invented by this guy named like Narcourt or Nowcourt or whatever, but it was originally created in the late 1700s, and as you can see, the very first time they tried to test it, they ran it straight into a wall, because it was almost impossible to drive, and it was very, very big and weird, and it also is considered to be one of the very first tractors, right? So like, now the thing about this original automotive though, is it just demonstrated the fact that people weren't ready to drive large vehicles over open spaces with no guidance. So how do you make it easier? Take this bad boy and slap it onto those rails that are already there. So George Stephenson comes along and he invents this thing called the rocket, right? And the rocket gets invented in 1830, and it's the very first steam-powered locomotive, right? And he was like, oh, we can use these rails that already exist as guidance systems, so we don't have to worry about people running this thing into a wall anymore, right? Way to go, guys. Very, very impressive. Now, George Stephenson's The Rocket is the very first locomotive, and as you can see looking at it right here, it was smaller, very simple. You shoveled coal into it, and it was mainly used to move items over shorter distances, right? Which worked out perfectly for Great Britain again, because they're an island, right? They're a smaller island where these cities are actually located near port cities and things like that, which is another giant reason why like Britain is going to be the home of the entire like industrial revolution, is because of the port system and island economic system that they have, right? So now you're going to start seeing, because of this device, write this down, you're going to start seeing cities pop up near central factory locations, central mining locations, and central port locations. You're going to see cities pop up like Manchester, Birmingham and other areas that are centrally located through the industrial paradigm, right? So like now the locomotive though is making it easy to move those items throughout those cities. Thank you, George Stephenson, for the rocket. We really, really appreciate it. And it becomes such a big thing during the Industrial Revolution, the idea of the locomotive and the shock and awe of this thing that can move things such great spaces, is that basically railroads are going to be put up everywhere rapidly all over the island. And also, you're going to see the growth of businesses that are going to come out of this as well. Because the continued downfall of the cottage industry and the putting out system is just being made more obsolete by railroads, right? This is further going to push forward the idea, though, also of the urban working class, right? So, because think about it this way. As these railroads get put up rapidly all over the island to connect now these major cities, if you're looking for a job now that the cottage industry is dying because factories are replacing your work, where are you going to go? You're going to go to these major cities that are popping up along the railroad networks. Networks, for example, like Birmingham, and for example, like, oh, and I know for a fact a couple of y'all are going to get so excited when we talk about Victorian era England, which is the second Industrial Revolution England. We're talking about like the Sherlock Holmes era, right? So the big soot factories and the and all that stuff. Now, the thing about it, though, is all you see in Victoria era England, like ideas, get off the doorknob. You're about to break out. Quit it. All right, so sorry, this little boy is an escape artist, all right? Like, he saw his mom go outside, and he was literally just pawing at the doorknob, right? So, but you're going to see the growth of these cities, and you're going to see the growth of this urban working class that works in a lot of them, the poorer urban working class anyway, going forward. And then, like I was saying a second ago, before I literally forgot that there were, like, a couple extra words on here, is you're going to see the shock and awe of these things even play out in the romantic art movement that's going on at the time, okay? Romantic artists are going to start painting beautiful pictures of locomotives and steam-powered devices and all these things going forward, demonstrating just the great lengths that technology has come. This one, for example, is by a very famous artist, Claude Monet, right? So, like, this is by Monet. Now, this, of course, though, is way into the Second Industrial Revolution because you see how advanced these trains are by comparison to Stephenson's rocket. But the big thing about it, though, is like you're seeing a lot of famous guys come along. One of my favorite artists ever, Joseph M.W. Turner, does a very famous piece using that the Fighting Tambourine, the one that's on the background of my smartboard, right? So, like, as you can see, the Industrial Revolution is permeating into all facets of society, and it probably is because due to the fact that Britain is like the workshop of the world at this point, right? And people in the continent are aware that these things are happening. People in the continent are aware that these things are going on. He almost broke out. He literally was up there hitting the lever to try and get out. So anyway. But the big thing, though, is that, yes, Britain is the workshop of the world, right? Everybody knows that something's going on there, but still the people in the continent aren't quite sure what is happening, right? Now, of course, this is during the First Industrial Revolution. Now, looking at the entire understanding of this, because due to the fact, why would they be called this? Well, mainly because they produce 2/3 of the world's coal by this point and half of its iron and cotton, right? So everyone is starting to realize that by the mid-1800s, that Britain is the industrial powerhouse, right? They're producing so many necessary commodities that it's just mind-boggling the rest of the world, right? There's only one country that is going to threaten their industrialism, and that's Germany in the early 1900s. Germany is going to have a massive industrial boom in the early 1900s, and it's going to be a really big reason why we lead into World War I, right? So, like, now, but the other big thing about it, there's another ridiculous statistic that demonstrates Britain's industrial output, because in 1750, before the Industrial Revolution began, historians predict that the British were responsible for producing about 2% of the world's industrial output. By 1860, they were responsible for 20% of it, right? So as you can see, Britain is leaving the continent far behind, right? They're like, okay, y'all can mess around with Napoleon and you can clean up and fix all that stuff. We're going to basically build and create everything, right? You're going to see literally the GNP. The GNP stands for Gross National Products of Britain is going to quadruple itself over the First Industrial Revolution. But here's the other kicker too. Very important. Star this statistic right here. Super big deal. Their population exploded, right? The Industrial Revolution also goes hand in hand with population growth, right? You're going to see the population of Britain go from 9 million in the early 1700s to 21 million within 70 years, right? So like you're talking about by the 1800s, they have 21 million. And remember, during the French Revolution, it was always considered that they were the most populated country by a long shot with 25 million, but Britain is gaining on them fast because of the Industrial Revolution. Now, you're also seeing a new development of science. You're seeing the growth of economics, right? Because of the Industrial Revolution and because of the great leaping forward of capitalism, capital systems, and free market societies, you're seeing the growth of these things called economic scientists and economic theory. By the way, just so you know, economics is known as the dismal science because it's like no matter how you slice it, no matter how you cut it, when it comes to economics, someone's getting stepped on, right? So like looking at this, you can see a lot of early economists come out during the Industrial Revolution, the first like economists, and they literally have different schools of thought in economics named after them, come along with very dismal outlooks on the progression of society after the Industrial Revolution. It's kind of one of those weird things where the Industrial Revolution is responsible for making the sweater that I'm wearing right now that's super comfortable and I love it, but it's also responsible for like population crises, right? So Thomas Malthus, also known as a Malthusian economist because he created the school of thought known as Malthusian economics, has an essay on the principle of population where he believed because of industrialization, we were going to start having population growth that was so drastic that we would outpace our resources and starve ourselves to death, right? Well, he was wrong. However, he was correct in one facet of it. We are using our resources at an unexponentially acceptable rate, right? So eventually we will run out of certain goods and figure out ways to replace them, right? So he is correct, though, on the population growing and the use of resources, right? It's just not as gloom and doom as he thought. But then you've got another guy named David Ricardo who popularizes this concept called the iron law of wages, right? Now, this one is the depressing law. The iron law of wages states that literally most of the working populace or working populace in general will always gravitate towards minimum wage, right? Due to the fact that like basically there's an excessive amount of workers. And now because of population growth and that there's a lot of workers, that labor for other jobs is not valued the same as it is in other areas, right? And so manual labor will gravitate towards a lower wage while other labors will not. And we'll talk more about the iron law of wages a little bit later, but David Ricardo and his ideas directly contrast somebody else that we're about to bring up in about. And I know one of y'all know who that guy is that we're about to bring up in about 2 seconds. He's got a long beard and he really loves the means of production being owned by the people. But we'll talk about him in a second. So you're going to see, like I said, with the earlier stuff, growing population, growing GNP, growing industrial outputs, growing factory classes, growing factory work, railroads, creating infrastructure and transportation, making all that stuff easier. You're going to see massive societal impacts of the Industrial Revolution as well, though, okay? So you're going to see basically the biggest one, though, is the changing of social classes. So you're going to see the social class paradigm change up quite a bit, okay? So you're going to end up having an upper class at the very top, which is your old money and what's left of the old nobility, right? So because remember, the Industrial Revolution didn't just do away with lords and nobles. They're still there, and they still own an excessive amount of land, excessive amount of resources, and an excessive amount of money. They're just going to twist and change how they make their money over time and go forward in a different direction, because that's a big thing. People at the top typically tend to try and stay at the top, right? So the upper class, which is the old money, the what's left of that old nobility, a lot of them are going to become invested in banking, and they're going to find their new futures in the Industrial Revolution and find ways to make money off of the money that they already have, right? Which is so depressing to say. Now, anyway, going forward, though, also we're going to see the growth of the industrial middle class, right? Which, as you can see, I've got a big brick right here. The industrial middle class is growing rapidly. So rapidly that by the end of the 1800s, you have your upper middle class, your middle class, and your lower middle class, right? So your lower middle class kind of flirts with being lower class, and they kind of like begin to organize them and things like that, which is going to be very important later on when it comes to unions and striking and trying to get more workers' rights. So in the industrial middle class, you're going to see huge growth, okay? Factory owners, professionals, the educated. We have formally always referred to these people as the bourgeois, right? So like the bourgeois is now becoming the industrial middle class, and where that word comes from, bourgeois, literally means city dweller, right? Or a person who lives in the city and has some money, right? Because B-O-U-R-G literally means it's like dweller of a city or in a fake part of town, right? A Burg or a Bürger for German like speakers out there means a person who lives in a city, okay? They're professionals, they're highly educated, and they also can be split into multiple layers like we talked about a little bit later on. Now, industrial working class, though, is going to be probably the biggest focal point of the Industrial Revolution because they are going to be where the seeds of communism grows. They're going to be where the seeds of revolutions grow, right? When we're talking about particularly the 1917 revolution in Russia, and when we're talking about the Paris Commune that does occur in 1871 in France, right? So, like, we'll talk about those things a little bit later on, but those are your factory workers, your laborers, right? Your hard workers that bust themselves to death just trying to make, like, ends meet, right? They also can be split into multiple layers, and we'll talk about those guys a little bit later on as well.